when massive wealth, coordinated lies, and intense religious rhetoric intersect right at the heart of a democracy. Who really pays the ultimate price for that manipulated knowledge?
That is the incredibly high-stakes question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really the core that drives the work we are diving into today.
Hmm.
We're looking at Katherine Stewart's, well, hard-hitting, nonfiction investigative work, Money, Lies, and God.
Right. And Stewart wrote this following the acceleration of these anti-democratic forces, particularly in early 2025. Her aim seems to be pulling back the curtain on systemic threats to American democracy, really naming names and identifying how structural vulnerabilities are being exploited.
Exactly. And our role here, for you listening, is to give a shortcut to understanding her argument, but also rigorously testing its foundations. We believe that some books really must be challenged. So this critique uses, where appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework. We map claims to evidence. We also apply an intellectual framework to look at the journey from facts to understanding.
And we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble as ethical benchmarks, identifying any asymmetries there.
Precisely. And we wrap up with a logical analysis and aim for a balanced conclusion.
And to help us navigate this, well, pretty dense subject for you, the listener, we're using advanced tools. You're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Stewart's central thesis is straightforward but definitely alarming. She argues a sophisticated, coordinated coalition, ultra-wealthy donors, powerful right-wing think tanks, certain religious groups, is actively working to undermine American democratic processes.
And their main tools.
Spreading disinformation and cultivating an exclusionary Christian nationalist ideology. The ultimate goal, she argues, serves authoritarian control.
Okay, let's unpack this then. If it's a coalition, it must have some kind of structure. What's the architecture of this powerful network Stewart identifies? And crucially, how does she map her claims to tangible evidence?
Well, she provides extremely detailed reporting, which is frankly a major strength of the book. She organizes these forces into 5 distinct categories, outlining their roles. She calls them the funders, the thinkers, the sergeants, the infantry, and the power players.
So it's not just a vague accusation, she's categorizing them.
Right. And she argues this isn't some shadowy cabal, but more like a coordinated ecosystem working together.
Okay, let's start at the top of that ecosystem, wealth and power. Who are these funders, and what evidence does she actually present to show they're coordinating against democratic norms?
Stewart really spent significant time tracing the money. She identifies key billionaire funders, often folks who benefit most from radical deregulation, low corporate taxes, and she documents their financial support flowing through these complex, dark money networks.
Dark money, meaning it's hard to track.
Exactly. She shows that this funding essentially bypasses transparency rules and lands directly in think tanks and activist groups pushing specific agendas.
So the evidence isn't just that they donate huge sums, but how and where the donations are aimed, specifically at dismantling oversight.
Precisely. The evidence suggests this wealth is being coordinated to achieve very specific political outcomes. Tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy, deregulation of polluting industries, weakening labor protections, things like that. This coordination, she argues, actively corrodes the democratic systems meant to check extreme economic power.
Okay, so that's the money. Next, you need an engine to drive the actual political machine, which she calls the disinformation engine. How does Stewart make the case that disinformation is central to the strategy rather than just, say, a side effect of heated politics?
She analyzes the coordinated nature of specific campaigns. It's not just mentioning election denial, for example. She traces how specific denial claims might move from a well-funded think tank, get picked up by a specific media outlet, and then are amplified at grassroots events like MAGA Roadshow.
So a pipeline?
A pipeline, yes. The same coordination applies to issues like vaccine myths or climate change denial. She maps it out.
That sounds like more than just casual lying. It sounds structural, like a weapon.
That's exactly her point. The book demonstrates that disinformation is deployed strategically. The goals seem to be twofold. First, destabilize public trust in all institutions, government, science, media, you name it.
It creates chaos.
Right. And second, to cultivate a sense of permanent cultural warfare, which is necessary for mobilizing their base.
Which brings us neatly to the third pillar she identifies, the ideological backbone, which she calls Christian nationalism. Now, for listeners who might confuse this with simply being personally religious, what is Stewart's specific definition here? What's the evidence?
That's a really crucial distinction she makes. Stewart profiles specific religious operations, policy advocacy groups, mobilization strategies.
Hmm.
She argues this isn't primarily about personal faith, it's about political power. Christian nationalism, as the book defines it, is the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation and must be governed by specific conservative Christian principles. This ultimately grants a subset of Americans. Historically, think white, male, conservative Christians, superior rights and political power over others.
And how is that ideology then translated into action by the sergeants and infantry she mentioned earlier?
Well, that's where the policy focus comes in. The faith rhetoric provides the moral justification or the cover for policy aims that actually subordinate other groups. We see this very clearly in pushes for legislation on reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ issues, and critically in the efforts toward the erosion of institutions.
Let's focus right there on that erosion, because these are the effects people might see or feel in their daily lives. What specific institutional attacks does Stewart document?
Though she goes into quite a bit of detail. Take public education. Stewart documents a very concerted effort to undermine public schools, often using massive funding for voucher programs.
So, school choice.
Well, she argues it's framed as choice, but the effect is draining money from the public system and redirecting it to private, often religious institutions that lack the same accountability.
That's a direct hit on a foundational public good. What about the legal system, labor?
In the courts, she details the long-term, highly focused strategy of appointing judges based on strict ideological litmus tests. The goal is manipulating legal precedent, often in favor of wealthy donors and conservative social agendas.
Right, we've seen reporting on that.
And she also dedicates significant space to documenting organized campaigns to weaken labor protections and crush unionization efforts. This ensures workers lose leverage while corporate power grows unchecked. These aren't isolated incidents. She presents them as systematic efforts causing institutional decay from within.
Wow, okay, that's a lot of interconnected parts.
It is. And after absorbing all that detailed reporting on this extensive network, we really have to turn our focus to the foundation of the book itself. We need to ask, how rigorous is the basis for these claims? We assess this by moving from factual certainty towards broader understanding.
Right, let's apply that critical framework. We can simplify this perhaps into 3 steps. First, let's talk about the facts themselves. How robust is Stewart's factual basis, what we call knowledge?
On knowledge, I'd say the book is extremely strong. Stewart's factual recounting of events, the specific funding trails she maps out, the direct policy effects she details, these are supported by extensive empirical research.
So footnotes upon footnotes.
Exactly. This isn't just conjecture. Her findings are often corroborated by other established investigative journalism. On the rigor test for hard facts, she definitely passes.
Okay, solid facts. The second step is understanding. Does she successfully connect those isolated facts, the donor lists, the think tank reports, the court decisions, into a narrative that makes sense? Is it coherent?
Yes, absolutely. The book offers a coherent synthesis. She successfully connects actors and strategies that might seem disparate at first glance. She shows, for example, how a billionaire's donation to a think tank might eventually result in, say, a curriculum ban in a small school district years later.
Connecting the dots.
Precisely. She links these seemingly random points into a single, recognizable pattern, demonstrating, she argues, a coordinated effort to undermine democratic norms. The analysis really holds together logically.
But then we get to the trickier part, the area of subjective interpretation, what we call opinion. Even with strong facts and logical connections, figuring out why people do things, their motives, that's complex. Where does the critique find room for reasonable disagreement?
Well, the main area of debate often surrounds her interpretation of the actor's deepest underlying motives. Stewart sometimes uses quite strong terms, like reactionary nihilism, to describe the intent of some coalition leaders.
Right.
Now, while the actions are factually documented, some critics argue that her interpretation of why people are acting their deep psychological intent or ultimate endgame is more open to reasonable debate. Is it truly a desire for authoritarianism per se, or is it perhaps just an extreme quest for political and cultural dominance? That distinction is where you find diverse opinions.
That's a subtle but important difference. And as you, the listener, reflect on distinguishing facts, understanding connections, and evaluating subjective motive, remember you can deepen your own critical thinking skills. We use Mindful Moments, that's our YouTube channel, offering AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts like this one. We're aiming to inspire reflection and rational thought using these exact tools.
And that reflection is absolutely critical as we transition from assessing the evidence within the book to applying more of a moral and ethical check to the action Stewart describes.
Right. Here's where we apply that ultimate fairness check. Stewart argues strongly for moral reciprocity. When we apply the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to the coalition's policies, what ethical discrepancies does she identify?
Stewart uses a really powerful thought experiment here. She essentially asks, would the advocates of these policies willingly accept the consequences for themselves?
For example.
For example, would those pushing for radical anti-union laws accept their own wages being suppressed in the same way? Or would those demanding religious dominance in public life accept having their own children potentially disadvantaged if a different dominant faith took over?
And the result of that fairness test, according to Stewart.
The analysis points to some pretty clear ethical asymmetries. The book argues that the trends she documents consistently privilege a narrow, specific demographic while actively subordinating or diminishing the rights and opportunities of others, whether based on race, gender, sexuality, or economic class. The policies, she concludes, are not built for mutual benefit or reciprocity.
Okay, beyond the golden rule, the book also measures the coalition's actions against the very foundation of American governance, specifically the goals laid out in the U.S. Preamble. Let's walk through how the coalition stacks up against those original aims.
Yeah, the preamble is used almost like a moral compass in her critique. First, take the goal to form a more perfect union. The book warns that the movement's intense focus on cultural warfare is actively driving polarization, fragmentation, and intentional political exclusion. It's arguably tearing the union apart, not perfecting it.
Okay, so undermining unity. If she sees these policies as fundamentally unfair, what specific examples show justice being undermined?
She points to the selective application of rights and obligations. Think about things like voting access or access to the judicial system itself. Justice, according to her analysis, is being skewed to benefit coalition members, often at the expense of fairness and equity for minority groups or political opponents.
How about the goal to promote general welfare? That seems pretty core.
The book argues that despite rhetoric about growth, the majority of Americans, especially working-class people, are ultimately harmed by the economic policies pushed by this coalition. Things like extreme deregulation and huge tax cuts that primarily concentrate wealth upward. These policies, she claims, are detrimental to the welfare of the general populace.
And finally, the big one, secure the blessings of liberty.
Here, Stewart argues that true freedoms, especially for minority and marginalized groups, are under direct threat from the increasingly authoritarian tactics she documents. Liberty, in this framing, is being secured for a select few, often by diminishing it for many others.
So a direct challenge to the founding principles.
That's the core of her ethical argument. Now, if we zoom out again to the bigger picture, we need to assess the book's overall logical framework, especially considering its main goal of exposing these threats. Stewart generally maintains strong logical consistency when analyzing these networks of power.
And this is where that important nuance comes in, right? Distinguishing between a coordinated network and just a grand conspiracy theory.
Exactly. And that's actually a strength of the analysis. She's careful to caution the reader against interpreting all coordination as some deep, overarching conspiracy driven by a single mastermind.
More complex than that.
Right. Instead, she portrays it more as a series of opportunistic alliances. You have different groups with potentially different primary motives, maybe wealth accumulation for some, religious dominance for others, raw political power for still others. But they align because they share a common goal of tearing down existing democratic structures that get in their way.
Which makes the threat seem perhaps more plausible and less like fiction.
I think that's the intention, yes. It feels more grounded in observable political maneuvering.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So when we summarize our critique, what are the key strengths that make this book a significant, maybe even necessary read?
Well, first, the rigor of the research. The extensive, detailed documentation she provides is really undeniable. Second, she offers a very accessible and powerful breakdown of complex coalitions and ideologies that can otherwise seem murky.
Makes it understandable.
Yes. And third, her work provides a nuanced ethical critique, connecting the practical consequences of policy decisions directly back to fundamental American values, like fairness and liberty.
What about the weaknesses then? Where do we find valid criticisms or limitations of the book?
One common criticism is that for people already deeply immersed in political analysis, the book might lack truly groundbreaking, novel revelations. It often excels at synthesizing and organizing existing investigative reporting into one coherent narrative, which is valuable, but perhaps not entirely new information for experts.
Okay.
Also, some of Stewart's suggested recommendations for democratic reform, particularly towards the end, are sometimes viewed as, well, idealistic, maybe even a bit naive, given the current level of political polarization and gridlock.
Hard to implement.
Very hard to implement in the current climate, yes. And lastly, some critics suggest the book focuses so heavily on the top-level power structures, the funders, the thinkers, that it might not fully capture the more nuanced sentiments or motivations of the actual grassroots conservative voters, the infantry, as she calls them, on the ground.
Interesting point. It leaves us then with the highest level of analysis, the wisdom assessment. What are the really big unresolved questions the book compels the reader to grapple with long after they finish the final page?
Oh, they are massive questions, really fundamental questions for civic engagement today. First, how can broad pro-democracy coalitions be mobilized and sustained effectively, especially given the entrenched, powerful opposition funding that Stewart details so meticulously? Definitely. Second, what practical, real-time strategies can actually counter these authoritarian advances as they're being deployed, not just analyzing them after the fact? And perhaps the most challenging question of all, can constitutional reforms and genuine civic renewal realistically succeed under the present political conditions, given the deep fragmentation she documents?
These are definitely the challenges that demand long-term attention, well beyond just reading one book.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, we want to acknowledge that this critique provides a transparent, evidence-based evaluation of Katherine Stewart's work. We've aimed to map her intent, her argument, its epistemic foundation, her ethical stance, and the practical implications, all guided by the book critique practical application framework we use.
The long-term damage the book warns about is stark. The erosion of public trust, the weakening of democratic systems, and perhaps most subtly, the profound spiritual harm that can come from weaponizing religion for purely political gain. These are the hidden costs, she suggests, of allowing lies and unchecked power to dominate the public sphere. It's certainly a necessary call for critical reflection and maybe even action.
We really encourage you to engage directly with this material yourself. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link if you're interested. And above all, think rationally.
And check out the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.